Throughout her entire 7-year tenure serving as a representative in the United States Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has ultimately failed to pass a single piece of legislation into binding law. While she undeniably commands a colossal digital audience of 8.6 million followers on Instagram, proudly models custom dresses at the prestigious Met Gala, graces numerous glossy magazine covers, and generates countless viral media clips, her actual legislative footprint remains entirely non-existent. She has secured far more appearances on cable television news networks than the majority of her congressional peers have attended standard committee meetings. Furthermore, she represents a specific district encompassing parts of the Bronx and Queens, a region where local rental costs have aggressively escalated every single year she has maintained her political office. Senator John Kennedy deliberately laid her entire professional record out on the table and confronted her with one paralyzing question that she was entirely unable to answer. Before the formal questioning could truly commence, Ocasio-Cortez attempted to seize control of the narrative. She deliberately rested one elbow upon the wooden desk, angling her chin upward by a precise margin that projected an attitude resting somewhere delicately between outright rebellion and rehearsed self-assurance. It was the highly calculated physical posture of a public figure who has survived 10,000 camera flashes and understands exactly which facial tilt the photographers prefer to capture. She confidently declared that the senator sitting opposite her belonged to an older generation entirely responsible for constructing the broken societal systems her modern generation was currently attempting to repair. She aggressively listed the ongoing housing crisis, the worsening climate crisis, the severe inequality crisis, and the failing healthcare crisis, labeling them not as novel dilemmas, but as ancient issues birthed by archaic policies. She insisted these systemic failures were fiercely defended by entrenched government officials who had occupied their offices for so long they tragically confused mere bureaucratic inertia with genuine political expertise. Instead of directing her gaze toward Kennedy during her monologue, she strategically angled her body toward the broadcast cameras. She addressed the mechanical lenses directly, fully aware of how a performer turns toward the specific audience they actually desire to influence. She loudly argued that the senator from Louisiana had occupied Washington since before she was even born, openly questioning whether anything in his home state had actually improved during his extensive political lifespan. She challenged him to prove if local poverty had decreased, if medical care had materially advanced, or if a single working-class family in Louisiana had ever woken up and expressed genuine gratitude for Senator Kennedy's presence in the United States Senate. Turning her attention back to the physical room, she claimed to deeply revere the democratic institution and respect the individuals present, but she boldly declared her refusal to equate mere seniority with actual tangible results. She pointedly remarked that certain individuals had occupied the Capitol building for several decades with absolutely nothing to show for their immense time, but a dedicated parking space and a lucrative retirement pension, emphasizing the word pension with a condescending half smile. She noted that these exact same political veterans dare to label younger newcomers as wildly inexperienced. She had essentially just branded him as elderly and entirely useless in front of a watching national audience. Senator Kennedy had not yet unclasped the folder resting before him on the desk. Concealed inside that folder was her complete record, 7 entire years of it, alongside a highly damaging document authored by her own campaign, detailing precisely why she willfully eradicated 25,000 jobs meant for her own constituent. Kennedy did not immediately snap back or furiously respond to the blatant insult. Instead, he absorbed the verbal assault patiently, much like an enduring man weathering a fierce but temporary storm, unrushed, entirely unstartled, and remaining firmly planted once the heavy winds inevitably ceased. His hands remained neatly folded together atop the table, his reading glasses perched precariously at the very tip of his nose, and his mouth kept firmly shut. He allowed the harsh echo of her aggressive voice to fully settle into the heavy atmosphere of the room, seeping into the carpet, the rich wood paneling, and the observation gallery, where the spectators were still mentally processing her sharp jab regarding his pension. He waited for 3 seconds, then 4. Removing his glasses, he meticulously polished the lenses with the bottom hem of his necktie. It was a small, quiet, profoundly domestic action that seemingly had no logical place inside a tense Senate hearing room, yet it belonged there perfectly because it was the deliberate gesture of a man who was in absolutely no rush and desperately wanted the entire room to recognize his calm. He gently replaced the glasses on his face, and when he finally spoke, his voice trailed significantly slower than its normal cadence. His thick Louisiana drawl stretched each syllable to its maximum capacity, allowing each vowel to occupy the exact physical space it was naturally meant to occupy. He politely conceded that she was entirely correct about one particular detail. He nodded a single time, executing the exact type of nod a person uses when conceding a trivial point they deem far too unimportant to aggressively debate. He freely acknowledged that he was indeed old, noting he had been elderly for quite some time. He calmly stated he was elderly while she was pouring drinks as a local bartender. Elderly when she initially campaigned for her congressional seat, and would likely remain elderly when her tenure in Congress eventually concluded, which he sharply hinted might occur much sooner than she currently anticipated given her current trajectory. Up in the observation gallery, a man tightly pressed his lips together and stared down at his hands. The camera could not distinctly reveal whether he was desperately suppressing a grin or merely composing his neutral expression. Kennedy paused again, not for theatrical dramatic effect, but to summon a deep memory. His eyes drifted past the immediate room, looking beyond the marble walls and the electronic microphones to a distant era that was neither here nor now. He explained that the distinct reality of being old means possessing a long memory, his voice suddenly dropping half a register. It grew not louder, but profoundly deeper, shifting the way a voice naturally deepens when recalling something incredibly authentic and real. He remembered an era when a standard manufacturing worker residing in her exact district could comfortably cover their entire monthly rent, utilizing just one single paycheck. He remembered a prosperous time when families residing in Queens actually owned their own properties, holding a legitimate mortgage, possessing a physical mailbox, and wielding their own front door key, rather than cramming 3 desperate people into a tiny subterranean basement dwelling. He reminisced about Monday mornings in the Bronx, where an eager job seeker could walk into a local business and secure permanent employment by the afternoon. He clarified he meant a real job, not an unreliable gig economy hustle or a brief 3-hour food delivery shift managed by a smartphone application, but a permanent position featuring full health benefits and a secure pension. He intentionally let the word pension hang in the air. It was the exact same vocabulary word she had weaponized as an insult a mere 30 seconds earlier, yet it carried a vastly different, heavier resonance now, symbolizing a secure future. He challenged her fierce critique of his generation's legacy, asking if she truly wanted to discuss what his peers had physically built. Opening his folder, he proudly declared that his generation had constructed the thriving middle class within her specific district, and he was sitting there today demanding to know exactly what had happened to it. Kennedy pointed out that she had officially served in the United States Congress for a total of 7 years. He directly asked her how many of the specific bills she had personally sponsored during that lengthy time frame had successfully transitioned into binding law. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to deflect, arguing that effective legislating is never quantified by the sheer volume of bills bearing one's personal name. Instead, she insisted it is measured by the cultural movements one builds and the societal conversations one shifts. Kennedy interrupted her with a gentle, incredibly patient tone, insisting it was indeed a measurable mathematical number, sounding remarkably like a gentle teacher waiting out a student who is actively avoiding a direct question. She pivoted again, claiming she had introduced highly significant legislation, specifically highlighting the Green New Deal, which she argued fundamentally reshaped the political landscape. Kennedy immediately interrupted, staring over the rims of his reading glasses to highlight the critical distinction between merely introducing a bill and actually passing it. He extracted a printed page from his folder and revealed the precise answer to his own inquiry. The answer was absolutely 0. In an entire 7-year span, she had entirely failed to enact a single piece of legislation into law. Legislative Effectiveness Ranking Kennedy cited GovTrack, an independent, nonpartisan congressional tracking entity, strictly noting it was not a Republican organization or a conservative blog. This neutral group ranked her an abysmal 230th out of 240 Democratic members for legislative effectiveness during the 116th Congress. Social media versus congressional action. He placed a second page on the table, juxtaposing her massive 8.6 million Instagram followers with her actual physical presence in Congress. House floor appearances. She had spent a mere 11 days speaking on the House floor during the entirety of the 117th Congress. Instagram activity. Conversely, she had published a staggering 412 Instagram posts during that exact same period. He let the two vastly different numbers sit side by side, much like placing two contrasting photographs next to each other in a family album, not to aggressively argue, but simply to display the glaring truth. He emphasized that she spoke on the House floor, the precise location her constituents elected her to stand only 11 times over 2 years, while posting online 412 times. Folding his hands, he noted that this stark ratio tells a devastating story, even if the individuals involved refuse to acknowledge it. Turning the page, his voice shifted again, moving closer rather than growing faster or louder, adopting the intimate tone used when discussing suffering human beings rather than cold statistics. He broke down the grim realities facing her constituents in the 14th district, spanning the Bronx and Queens. Housing costs, median rental prices have aggressively surged every single year since she took office. Poverty levels. The poverty rate, specifically in the South Bronx, remains stubbornly above 30%. Living conditions. Public housing facilities endure freezing winters entirely devoid of heating or hot water, plagued by toxic mold growing on walls and rodents roaming the hallways. He acknowledged that she was acutely aware of these terrible conditions. She frequently toured these decaying facilities, aggressively photographing the mold and extensively posting the images online. He paused briefly, not for theatrical drama, but to highlight the massive distance between creating a social media post and drafting a binding law, the immense gap between photographing toxic mold and passing legislation that actually removes it. He stressed that she had failed to fix anything in 7 years, failing to pass or even bring a relevant bill to the floor. She had merely posted about the misery, and he firmly reminded her that posting is not fixing. Her struggling constituents, he noted, cannot physically reside inside an Instagram story. In the fourth row of the audience, the older woman with gray hair, sitting alone with her purse resting on her lap, nodded a single time. It was not a performative gesture, but a deeply private nod from a person who had been desperately waiting to hear someone loudly articulate the exact thoughts they had harbored in silence for a very long time. Kennedy pressed further, noting that there are children growing up right now in her district, trapped in mold-infested public housing, who will inevitably turn 18 before she ever passes her very first law. Staring over his glasses, he asked what she would eventually tell those children she actually accomplished for them. Would she brag that she attended the exclusive Met Gala or accumulated 8.6 million followers? He bluntly stated that a hungry child suffering in a mold-infested room gains zero sustenance from a digital follower. Leaning aggressively forward, Ocasio-Cortez planted her elbows on the table and clasped her hands tightly together. When she finally spoke, her voice adopted a highly precise, calculated tone she reserved for constructing arguments she genuinely believed in, placing each distinct word like a heavy brick to build a load-bearing sentence. She forcefully asserted that impactful legislation transcends superficial vanity metrics. Instead, it is measured by the vast cultural movements one builds and the ability to shift the theoretical Overton window. She proudly claimed immense credit for mainstreaming critical discussions, noting that before her congressional arrival, absolutely nobody in the building was discussing the Green New Deal, a federal employment guarantee, or the massive scale of infrastructural investment required for the country to survive the next 50 years. She insisted that forcing those vital conversations onto the table is the true definition of modern 21st century leadership. Defending her heavy reliance on Instagram, she argued she uses it because that is where the actual citizens reside on their smartphones, in their kitchens, or during brief work, she boldly stated she goes directly to the people, sarcastically suggesting he could sit alone in an empty chamber talking to himself and label it legislating if he preferred. A nervous staffer seated directly behind her adjusted the collar of her blazer, a tiny, unnecessary physical gesture made by someone who falsely believes their boss has just landed a devastating rhetorical blow. Kennedy patiently waited for the staffer's twitchy gesture to conclude. He allowed the tense air to carry her defiant words for a few highly uncomfortable seconds, mirroring the polite patience of allowing a dinner guest to finish their toast before raising your own glass. When he finally responded, his voice was incredibly slow, and that deliberate slowness became the absolute focal point. He acknowledged her claim regarding shifting the Overton window, nodding in agreement that she likely had done so. However, he brutally countered that the struggling citizens in her district do not physically reside within a theoretical political window. They live in tangible, decaying apartments, plagued by mold and greedy landlords who hike the rent every January. He firmly stated that theoretical conversations cannot physically pay a monthly rent invoice. Only passing binding laws can accomplish that. Unfolding and refolding his hands, he reminded her she had completely failed to pass even one. The staffer behind her immediately stopped adjusting her clothing. Kennedy seamlessly transitioned to discussing the catastrophic loss of 25,000 local jobs. He recited the historical timeline with the grim precision of a lawyer reading a property deed at a closing, listing dates, names, numbers, and devastating consequences. In 2018, Amazon formally announced massive plans to construct a secondary headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, located immediately adjacent to her jurisdiction. This monumental project promised 25,000 employment opportunities, boasting an impressive median salary of $150,000. Furthermore, it was fully expected to generate a staggering $27 billion in state tax revenues for New York over a 2-decade period. The initiative enjoyed incredibly broad political support. Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo championed it. Democratic Mayor Bill de Blasio backed it. The local community boards endorsed it, and the organized construction labor unions fiercely supported it. Kennedy emphasized the magnitude of 25,000 local families suddenly securing lucrative employment. Despite this overwhelming local approval, she vehemently opposed it, actively campaigning against the development. Reading her exact past words, he noted she labeled the massive investment as an exercise in corporate greed and horrific worker exploitation. Ultimately, on Valentine's Day in 2019, Amazon officially withdrew from New York entirely. They packed up the 25,000 jobs, the massive tax revenue, and the 2 decades of guaranteed economic development, entirely relocating the massive project to Virginia instead. Kennedy presented 2 contrasting pieces of paper side by side on his desk. On the left rested a physical printout of her triumphant digital tweet from that exact day, where she gleefully celebrated that everyday New Yorkers had successfully defeated Amazon's corporate greed, worker exploitation, and the immense power of the world's wealthiest man. On the right side rested the cold, hard numbers: 25,000 lost jobs, $150,000 average salaries vanished, and $27 billion in lost tax revenue. He pointed out that in exchange for supposedly defeating corporate greed, everyday New Yorkers received absolutely nothing: no jobs, no tax revenue, no construction projects, and no paychecks. He quoted her own Democratic governor, Andrew Cuomo, explicitly noting he was not a Republican or a partisan talk show host. Cuomo publicly labeled the disaster a massive lost economic opportunity directly caused by a tiny faction of politicians who prioritize their own narrow political interests far above their community's welfare. Kennedy looked up, directly reminding her that her own governor said that specifically about her. Turning another page, he reminded her of the local Queens, small businesses, the eateries, laundromats, bodegas, and daycares that had invested heavily in renovations and hiring, desperately expecting a massive influx of 25,000 new customers. They prepared for a massive economic boom that she single-handedly canceled. He set the page down, noting that many of those small businesses ultimately went bankrupt and closed, not due to broader economic forces or market shifts, but entirely because of her actions. For his final, most devastating revelation, Kennedy reached beneath his stack of documents and produced one last page. He announced his intention to read an internal campaign polling document authored by her very own staff, obtained by the committee from a former campaign employee. He adjusted his glasses and read the statistics incredibly deliberately, giving each individual number immense weight, allowing the brutal mathematics to do all the heavy lifting. Her own campaign polling team had run the internal numbers regarding the Amazon deal, thoroughly surveying her specific district. An overwhelming 67% of likely voters within her actual district strongly supported the Amazon headquarters. Kennedy repeated the number for emphasis. 2 out of every 3 local citizens she was elected to represent desperately wanted those jobs. He continued reading the memo, revealing that conversely, 84% of her national donor base, wealthy contributors residing in California, Massachusetts, and Oregon, who aggressively follow her on social media but have never walked a single block in Queens, fiercely opposed the corporate partnership. He read the final strategic recommendation at the bottom of the internal memo, his steady voice remaining entirely unchanged, with the sheer absence of emotional change serving as the emotional gut punch. The memo explicitly stated that while local district numbers heavily favored the deal, the national donor and personal brand numbers were completely clear. Opposing Amazon aligned perfectly with the national progressive lane, so the campaign officially recommended opposing the deal. Setting the page down, Kennedy summarized the devastating truth. Her own internal campaign staff explicitly informed her that her local district desperately wanted those jobs, yet they advised her to slaughter the deal regardless. She didn't kill the massive project because it was detrimental to Queens. She killed it because opposing it was immensely profitable for her personal political brand. She knowingly sacrificed 25,000 local livelihoods because it polled incredibly well with wealthy donors located 3,000 miles away who had never set foot in her neighborhood. The struggling people of Queens desperately wanted employment, but her wealthy donors demanded a flashy headline. Folding his hands, he bluntly stated that she actively chose the headline over her own people. Standing up, Kennedy slowly walked the entire length of the table, gently touching each printed document as he passed by it. He tapped the dismal legislative record, the embarrassing Instagram ratio, the devastating Amazon statistics, and the damning internal polling memo. Each touch represented a full year in office, and each year represented an undeniable failure. These failures had quietly accumulated until someone finally bothered to count them out loud. 0 bills passed in 7 years, ranked 230 out of 240 inches overall effectiveness. 11 pathetic days on the House floor compared to 412 online posts, 25,000 local jobs slaughtered, and a secret memo proving she actively betrayed her district to appease distant donors. Stopping at the end of the table, he turned and stared at her across the long row of white pages. He reminded her that she had mocked him for being old, readily agreeing that he was indeed old enough to remember when the title representative actually carried genuine meaning. His heavy voice carried the distinct weight of a massive burden being carefully set down. He explained that true representation means serving the local citizens who physically elected you, not appeasing wealthy political action committee donors residing in zip codes you have never visited, nor bowing to digital followers or gala organizers. A true representative fights for the individuals living on their local streets, riding the crowded subways, and sending their kids to decaying schools plagued by moldy ceilings. Pausing once more, his voice dropped to a profoundly quiet register, abandoning cold statistics to focus purely on humanity. He spoke again of a hypothetical 7 or 8-year-old girl residing in the Bronx public housing units that Ocasio-Cortez so frequently exploited for photo opportunities. That little girl walks to school past empty, vacant lots where booming factories used to stand, returning to a freezing apartment where the heating systems completely fail in January. Kennedy warned that when this young girl eventually grows up, learns to read, and begins investigating history, she will ultimately review Ocasio-Cortez's entire congressional record. When that child asks what her representative actually accomplished for her, Ocasio-Cortez will only have theoretical concepts about the Overton window, a failed Green New Deal, empty Instagram metrics, and a glamorous Met Gala dress to offer. Kennedy predicted that the girl would respond the same way any disappointed child responds to an adult who repeatedly made massive promises but entirely failed to keep them. Removing his glasses, he folded them and set them down, firmly stating his case was closed. He allowed his heavy questions to settle into the silent room, resting at the absolute bottom like a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. He concluded by addressing her earlier insult about his generation breaking things. He admitted they may have broken some things, but they overwhelmingly built tangible infrastructure. Factories, roads, hospitals, and schools, constructed with physical labor and taxpayer funds. Conversely, he noted she had entirely failed to build a single tangible thing in 7 years, and the absolute only thing she successfully tore down was 25,000 local jobs her own constituents desperately desired. Sitting back down, he declared that was her personal record, not his. When the committee chairman formally asked if the gentlewoman from New York wished to officially respond, Ocasio-Cortez slowly opened her mouth. She began to state that she had dedicated her entire career to public service, but the sheer weight of the word career suddenly caught in her throat. Hearing herself utter the word out loud, now permanently tethered to 7 empty years and absolute zero legislative achievements, completely paralyzed her sentence, stopping her momentum just as a heavy stone completely stops a rolling wheel. Her signature defiant chin previously tilted upward in calculated rebellion since the moment she sat down, physically lowered by 1/4 of an inch. It was not a dramatic collapse, merely the subtle lowering of a proud flag when the sustaining wind completely dies. Her gaze drifted downward from Kennedy, moving across the desk to the damning row of white documents containing her indisputable record. Moving her hands into her lap completely out of the camera's view, she quietly murmured that her record was merely a work in progress. These 6 words constituted the absolute quietest sentence she had ever spoken aloud during a public hearing. Up in the gallery, the older gray-haired woman who had previously nodded during Kennedy's speech glared down at Ocasio-Cortez with the deep, profound disappointment of a grandmother who has caught a grandchild in a massive transgression. They are not yet mature enough to comprehend. Kennedy softly replied, confirming it was indeed a work in progress, but gently reminded her that her suffering constituents had been patiently waiting for 7 long years and desperately wanted to see actual results. The video clip of the confrontation rapidly saturated the internet, traveling with unstoppable velocity. A heavily edited 6-0-second version highlighting the devastating ratio of zero bills, 8.6 million followers, 11 floor days, and 412 posts accumulated a massive 40 million views in a mere 48 hours. Meanwhile, the full 2 1-minute unedited version resonated deeply with older demographics who watched it on their living room televisions with the volume cranked up, deeply appreciating that someone had finally loudly articulated the exact frustrations they had harbored in silence for years. Within 24 hours, 4 Democratic members of the New York delegation released official public statements demanding general accountability, though none dared mention Ocasio-Cortez by name. Simultaneously, the FEC officially initiated a preliminary legal review regarding the leaked internal polling memo. Amazon's corporate public relations office released a brutally brief 1-line statement confirming their massive offer to New York remained permanently withdrawn, conveying immense finality. The digital hashtag #TheirCord relentlessly trended online for 3 consecutive days. In Astoria, Queens, a 63-year-old man named Miguel sat silently in his daughter's living room, absorbing the full, lengthy broadcast on television. Miguel had previously owned and operated a local laundromat in Long Island City, situated merely 2 blocks away from the proposed Amazon site. When the massive project was initially announced in 2018, He had immediately begun investing in expansions, planning to hire additional staff, extend his operating hours, and erect a new bilingual grand reopening sign to welcome the impending economic boom. However, after the Congresswoman successfully campaigned against the deal and Amazon permanently fled, the anticipated flood of customers never arrived. His commercial lease inevitably increased, and without the projected revenue, he was eventually forced to permanently shutter his business in March of 2020 and move into his daughter's spare room. Watching Kennedy discuss the 25,000 lost jobs, Miguel quietly realized he hadn't personally needed 25,000 jobs. He simply needed 25 extra daily patrons to survive, a tiny, microscopic fraction of the massive prosperity Ocasio-Cortez had single-handedly destroyed. He didn't share the viral video or post angry comments online. He simply turned off the television and sat in the profound quiet of a house that was not his own, resting in a chair he did not own, mourning the painful loss of a business he spent 14 years building, knowing he was now far too old to ever build another. Miles away, in Madisonville, Louisiana, Senator John Kennedy relaxed on his porch alongside his wife, Becky, slowly sipping a glass of iced tea that had gradually grown warm. Becky had watched the entire hearing on their kitchen television and deliberately chose not to ask him about it, knowing he didn't require any debriefing. He spoke anyway, completely ignoring the political theatrics to focus entirely on the hypothetical little girl freezing in the Bronx public housing. He took a sip of his warm tea, expressing profound sorrow for the neglected citizens of the 14th District. He firmly stated his belief that their representative would never actually fix a single thing for them, as she was entirely too preoccupied with maintaining her massive fame to execute the grueling daily work of governing. The loud crickets and warm Louisiana night perfectly matched the heavy weight of a highly consequential day. Simultaneously, inside her darkened Washington, D.C. apartment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her open laptop. Her Instagram notifications were rapidly cascading down the screen, violently splitting into two distinctly warring factions. Sycophantic supporters desperately typed praises, calling her a queen and an icon, claiming her enemies were terrified of her. Conversely, harsh critics relentlessly spammed the comments, with zero bills, record, and Kennedy's devastating quote about citizens not living inside an Overton window. She scrolled and read until she slowly closed the laptop, mimicking the solemn action of closing a book that revealed a harsh truth she desperately wished she could unread. Gazing out the window at the darkening Washington skyline, the haunting image of the young girl in the Bronx entirely consumed her thoughts. She hadn't considered her before Kennedy's speech, but now she couldn't banish the thought. Kennedy's inescapable question echoed loudly in her mind, sitting beside her like an unwanted guest, refusing to leave. What did you actually do for me? The undeniable answer was zero. Zero was an immovable reality that absolutely could not be spun, tweeted, or theorized away by shifting a political window. It was the absolute emptiest number in existence, signifying a total absence of accomplishment. That empty void was now undeniably her permanent record. 0 bills passed, 25,000 local jobs slaughtered, and a damning memo proving she willfully betrayed her constituents to appease distant, wealthy donors. Confronted with a choice, she had actively chosen the donors,